On the modern battlefield, communications are often king. They might be the difference between a lethal kill chain capable of directing a precision munition against a valuable enemy target hundreds of kilometres away, or those same expensive PGMs generating at best an expensive fireworks show and at worst a friendly fire incident. All of that very much holds true for the war in Ukraine, where the drone war in particular is enabled as much by modern communication systems as the drones themselves. Generally speaking, there are a number of characteristics that go into a good comm system. You want it to be affordable, easy to use, resistant to opposing electronic warfare. Military users probably want it to be mobile, rugged, and good enough and available enough to support a whole range of military operations. And it's for those and a variety of other reasons that we saw the large-scale adoption of satellite internet terminals, especially Starlink, by both Russian and Ukrainian forces. There is, however, another characteristic of good comms. Preferably, you want your opponent to not have an off switch for them. And it's there that Russia's Starlink-dependent systems, from attack drones to control teams on the ground, recently suffered a bit of a problem, with SpaceX suddenly shutting down every Starlink terminal in Ukraine and Russia, not specifically on a whitelist, controlled by the Ukrainian government, suddenly changing the role of all of the terminals in Russian service, from comms to cosmetics. And so today I want to use that development as an opportunity to take a bit of a look at military communications in Russia and Ukraine, and how corruption, technology and overconfidence arguably combine to make Russia increasingly reliant on a system that could suddenly be bricked by a single decision in a foreign country. To do that, we'll start with the basics, why good communications are so central to modern warfare, and why both Russia and Ukraine turn to civilian quote-unquote tools like Starlink in order to enable them. Then we'll look at some estimates about how widely satellite internet, specifically Starlink, was deployed on both sides, what happened to cause the recent outage on the Russian side of the line, and what early evidence we have about the impact that's having. Then, to close out, we'll look at some big picture observations on two levels. Firstly, focused on Ukraine, so what this teaches us and what might happen next. And secondly, just a couple of short takeaways for other countries looking at this, wondering what this might all tell them about their preparations for future wars or crises. Okay, so first things first. In order to understand why tools like Starlink mattered so much, I think we need to clarify why good comms are really bloody important, and how corruption, technology, and other elements came together to create a Russian military that needed to rely on an openly available Western technology in order to keep its kill chains in Ukraine functioning as effectively as possible. In saying that, there is one big caveat to put up front, which is that when you're talking about the effectiveness of one side's communications or its command and control capabilities, the technology is really only just one piece of the puzzle. It's also about things like how you design your networks and how you enable communications. If I'm a platoon commander, for example, and I want to call fires on something that's making my life very, very difficult, even if I have access to science fiction tier communications technology, something that lets me send 4K video around the world near instantaneously despite any jamming the opponent might throw at it, if that communication needs to go through 16 different layers and nodes before it finally gets to the battery commander that's actually going to respond to my request, I might still be waiting a long time for those shells to start coming in. That concept is particularly relevant in Ukraine, so we might come back to it a bit later on, but the point is, technology by itself doesn't solve communications problems. That said, it can really help. And to illustrate that, I want you to think about at least 4 main ways that a military communication system can potentially go wrong. Basically, failure modes, if you like, where a system is either not fast enough, not accurate or clear enough, vulnerable to compromise or enemy action, or technically unsuitable for the kind of communication required. If your communications aren't fast enough, for example, it's possible for decision makers to be making decisions based on information that's outdated. That potentially might allow an opponent to take refuge in audacity and speed to get inside your decision-making loop and get away with stuff that, on paper, they really shouldn't. The German forces breaking through the Ardennes during the invasion of France during World War II, especially in the early phases, weren't particularly powerful and would have potentially been vulnerable if a powerful counterattack had been thrown against them. But as in many other campaigns, speed, surprise, and confusion functioned as their operational armour, if you like. Give the French High Command in that situation access to live drone footage from the front and near instantaneous visibility of those German armoured thrusts, and maybe you get a different outcome. Another issue can be clarity, accuracy, and confusion. Through history, an unfortunate number of troops have been killed, essentially because of confused or misunderstood orders. One of the most famous historical examples here is the charge of the British Light Brigade during the Crimean War. A lot of you listening will know the story, the British light cavalry charging headfirst into a Russian artillery position and being shot to pieces. But what isn't always known is that the charge was a result of a confused order. The cavalry received this order from the British commander Lord Raglan, quote, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left. Immediate." To simplify a battle, a core issue here is that from his position, Lord Raglan could see Russian troops preparing to remove captured guns from overrun Turkish positions. But from their positions, the officers of the Light Brigade receiving that order couldn't actually see that happening, and so interpreted the order as requiring them to charge a different, prepared Russian battery. Now, I'm sure all the officers in the audience will be quick to say that there are some human errors going on here. The commander is forgetting the difference between his perspective and those of his subordinate commanders, and issuing an order that isn't sufficiently clear, while a subordinate receiving an order that appears to call for them to YOLO their entire unit into an enemy defensive position might potentially have cause to at least seek clarification first. But from a technological perspective, I'd suggest that perhaps the confusion would have been less likely to occur if the orders in question had looked a little bit less like this, and instead a little more like this. The British Army in Crimea obviously didn't have access to a modern battle management system, but I can't imagine they would have said no to one. Circles, arrows, and grid references are sometimes easier to understand than Dr. Scrawl plain text. Issue number 3, where technology can potentially help, is vulnerability to enemy action. Whether that's vulnerability to interception because your communications aren't coded or insufficiently well coded, or the enemy being able to disrupt your communications, for example, through electronic warfare. There is, after all, a reason why expensive encrypted military communication systems are a thing, and you can't just issue all your troops a Nokia 3210 and a SIM card and call it a day. All of those are relevant to the story of Starlink in Ukraine, but this final one especially so, which is whether a communication system is capable of sending at all the types of communications you want sent. A Morse code operator and a teenager with Telegram, for example, can both send text messages. Maybe the keypad, especially with autocomplete, is faster, but a force could potentially either just deal with the speed difference, or in some cases, maybe you make up for it by just adding more operators. If you want to send a video file, though, good luck doing that, even with an arbitrarily large number of people communicating in dots and dashes. If what you really need to make your drone war work is a video feed, digital or analog audio, especially with the time delay, just isn't going to cut it. I think there's also a broad observation to make here up front that while military communications technology has improved dramatically, especially over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, the military's reliance on almost addiction to good communications has also scaled up at a breakneck pace. The key driver there is that often good communications have gone from being a value add, a nice to have, to something you fundamentally need in order to make your weapons or your way of war work. An ancient military where most of the killing power was provided by the push of the pike might benefit from good communications and coordination, but even if no one has any bloody clue what's going on, the stabby sticks are still going to work and you can probably see your opponent. On a modern battlefield where most casualties are generated by fires, so everything from indirect artillery to drone strikes, barring extremely niche cases like artillery operating in the direct fire mode, none of that shit is going to work properly if the sensor can't talk to the shooter, or in the case of drones, a controller can't talk to the weapon. Whether you're talking about a strategic or battlefield level, often speed, reliability, and clarity are no longer optional. Nuclear deterrence, for example, doesn't really work well if the command authority can't reliably and quickly talk to the launchers. While at a tactical level, something like a Russian Iskander strike against a dynamic Ukrainian target relies on that missile getting both very precise targeting coordinates and getting that information before the target moves somewhere else. As you probably gather from that example, precision weapons are a significant part of this story. Compared to just blanketing an area with dumb ordnance, precision weapons can be incredibly efficient, but a precise weapon needs precise and timely information in order to generate that effect. They could potentially thrive where you have access to things like reliable data links that share information on friend and foe identities and locations, and are also a big part of the reason you can't just throw away all this newfangled jam-vulnerable communications equipment and go back to good old unjammable pen, paper, and motorcycle couriers or something. What the war in Ukraine has arguably demonstrated is both the value of good, accurate, timely, and resilient communications, but also multiple different ways forces might be able to maneuver around an absence of them, as well as demonstrating, I think fairly clearly, the drawbacks that often come with them. If the system can't always do what it needs to do to support precision strikes, for example, sometimes you might just choose to ditch the precision element. Russian cannon and rocket artillery systems, for example, have often been used to engage Ukrainian area targets. And so instead of dispatching a couple of precise munitions, you instead saturate it with a bunch of unguided ones addressed to grid coordinates rather than a particular target. Autonomy is another example we've talked through in the past, where you might enable a drone, for example, to make its own decisions if it can't maintain a connection with its operator, based on some pre-programmed set of criteria. This is sometimes described as a relatively new or groundbreaking phenomenon, but I'd argue that giving autonomy to get around communication lag and difficulty is actually a really old phenomenon. It's just in the past, the autonomous system involved wasn't a drone, it was a junior officer or NCO. The practice of mission command, where lower level leaders are given their commander's intent and objective, but then given the ability to autonomously make decisions based on the battlefield conditions they encounter, is arguably partly an adaptation to the fact that senior commanders can't be in the trench observing the conditions and make the type of timely, context-reliant decisions necessary to make a lot of those tactics work. A final option, and one we've often seen both the Russians and Ukrainians lean towards, is that rather than always try and work around the limits of bad communications, just build better ones. Invest in building up a resilient communication system that can actually move the information you need moved as fast as you need it moved. And it's hard to imagine a lot of the tactics the Ukrainians and Russians have come to rely on functioning if those communications aren't in place. While the media might be tempted to sometimes describe Russian infantry infiltration and assault tactics as unsophisticated, if you think about it, they actually rely fairly heavily on very good communications. If your tactic is to continuously push small groups of infantry through relatively porous Ukrainian lines, hope that enough of them will make it that eventually they can accumulate and carry on, it's pretty handy to be able to talk with, coordinate, and resupply the ones who make it through. Because if you can't coordinate, support, and supply them, a lot of the time it's going to look less like an infiltration assault and more like a time-delayed donation to Ukraine's POW exchange fund. Meanwhile, Ukrainian defensive tactics are also heavily network-reliant. To oversimplify, this is a system built around a very sparsely manned frontline with relatively few infantry forward, lots and lots of interconnected sensors, i.e. drones, and decentralized fires, whether those be attack drones, artillery, or something else. The Ukrainian system only works if you can rapidly identify Russian targets or an attack in progress, and then transmit that information to something that's going to stop it, whether that be a local drone team or an artillery unit. The artillery units answering those calls for fire are also likely to be widely dispersed, meaning you need fast, reliable communications that operate right down to the level of the individual gun. And then there are long-range drone operations, which are a whole level of demand again. So by now you probably get the picture. Both of these militaries need access to really good comms that tick a whole bunch of boxes. Why then might a civilian tool like Starlink potentially enter the picture? Surely you might think there were military systems available that could do the job better than a system partly designed so a bloke out in Alice Springs can stream Netflix. The best answer I can give there is kind of. There are plenty of reasons Russian and Ukrainian troops might have started to reach for the Starlink dishes or other available civilian communication solutions, starting with perhaps the simplest motive of all. In some cases, there might just not be enough military-grade communications kit to go around. For some observers, some of the most shocking images to come out of the earlier stages of the Russian invasion were ones like this. This is claimed to be an example of a radio captured from Russian forces by Ukrainian troops early in 2022. It's also a totally unencrypted Chinese Baofeng radio, of the kind you can probably buy for a few dozen bucks online. This helps explain the rather surreal experience some of us were having earlier in the war, where members of the general public could just tune in and listen to some Russian military comms. It was far from a universal problem, but I have been able to listen to a bunch of Russian chatter from 2022, up to and including stuff like calls for fire or reporting very loudly of friendly fire incidents. Critically, this is not because Russian engineers haven't figured out to build something like an encrypted radio. Those existed and were meant to be, at least, in widespread Russian service. What you'll see on the right there, for example, is the R187 Azat, and this is essentially a 6th-generation handheld encrypted software-defined radio, roughly equivalent to some of the units you might see in United States or other NATO service. These are meant to operate in the VHF-UHF band, can be used as a repeater station, and utilise GLONASS or GPS to provide positioning. We reportedly first saw them issued in around 2017 to 90th Guards Tank Division, with reports of further rollouts taking place from there. A little bit older, but obviously more powerful given the size and role, the communications nerds in the audience might recognise the R168 on the right there. This is a family, a very large family, of 5th-generation tactical radios. Many of these are, for example, going to be vehicle-mounted, intended for use at longer ranges, think up to 350 kilometres, and we first saw the Russian military introduce them in the year 2000. Now, it stands to reason if troops have access to relatively capable 5th and 6th-generation military radios, they're probably not going to be quick to strap on unencrypted Chinese walkie-talkies. And we can be relatively confident at least a significant amount of this stuff existed, in part because the Ukrainians captured a bunch of it starting in 2022. So if the problem was not an engineering one, what gives? And while it comes up so often, it might as well count as a free space on the bingo card at this point. One answer here, once again, appears to be corruption. As Russian sources tell the story, the military invested extensively in digital communications through a number of programs. Across the board, it's hard to know exactly how much money was invested, but one source I'll link gives the price of digital telecommunication systems and tactical radios alone at about $250 million US. And wherever you have an extensive Russian state program, you'll have officials or military leaders willing to get entrepreneurial about it. One case of a real-life General Oligarchov figure, for example, is this bloke here, General Aslanov, former head of the main communications directorate. According to the investigators in his corruption case, as Russian state media tells it on the right there, the general was allegedly involved in multiple gross fraud cases, worth combined north of $100 million. His case was also far from the only one. This article refers to multiple senior officers, including another general and a colonel, again receiving multi-year sentences. And we could go through alleged cases covering everything from infrastructure upgrades to the procurement of some of those aforementioned handheld radios. What's claimed there is that instead of Russian-made equipment, in some cases Russian troops received Chinese radios, but with altered identification plates at inflated prices, which implies to me someone bought the cheaper Chinese system, slapped a Cyrillic label or two on it, and then conveniently pocketed the price difference. Aslanov, if you're wondering, was sentenced to 17 years in prison. The exact scale of the problem here is hard to determine for sure, because the only cases we can confidently become aware of are those the Russian system actively chooses to prosecute. I think it's fair to assume that in any system endemically dealing with corruption, the problem probably runs far deeper than what you see people charged for. And whatever the cause or collection of causes, we saw at least symptoms of some shortages on the Russian side well before February 2022. They may not always have been dramatically widespread, and might have sometimes been driven by other factors like local supply issues, a desire for redundancy, or as was the case with Starlink, as we'll get to in a bit, sometimes a search for a given functionality or capability that the Russian equipment might not necessarily provide. But the signs of some rough edges in the supply situation were there. One example that comes to mind is Russian propaganda footage choosing to highlight Russian Sukhoi 34s operating over Syria, appearing to use civilian Western GPS systems. So problem one might simply have been a lack of sufficient availability of modern military systems. And while it might be tempting to throw stones at the Russian procurement systems and the latest adventures of General Oligarchov in this case, I think it's important to remember that this can and has happened to Western forces before. With the article on the right there, and its example of the sterling state of British military communications during the war in Iraq, standing as just one example. The war in Ukraine has arguably highlighted that a lot of militaries don't have, for example, the ammunition or spare parts necessary to fight an intense, sustained war. But I'd suggest that given the potential consequences of a shortage, comms gear probably deserves to be on that priority list as well. But in either case, in 2022 at least, you appear to have a situation where either there's not enough kit to go around, or if there hypothetically is, it's not getting to where it needs to be. In that situation, rather than falling back on carrier pigeons and smoke signals, in some cases troops appear to have reverted to what they knew and what they had available: civilian or unencrypted communication systems. And those brought with them all of those problems we discussed near the start of the episode. Some Russian comms that were so insecure that you had Reddit threads briefly dedicated to listening to them, while some Ukrainian sources complained that some of the equipment they were using was later compromised by the Russian military. Even where it was impossible for one side or the other to read the other's comms, that didn't mean falling back on civilian communications was without its own risks. It's just a reality that a lot of communication systems double as location systems. The Russian military, for example, publicly blamed the use of mobile phones by some of its troops for a number of Ukrainian artillery and missile strikes. Mobile phones have to ping a cell tower, and if that cell tower happens to be in Ukraine, then there might not be an enormous difference between a bunch of Russian troops calling home and them calling the nearest Ukrainian HIMARS unit. Wi-Fi systems can also be really dangerous from a signature management perspective. With the right equipment, you can usually locate a Wi-Fi transmitter well before you're close enough to actually connect with it, meaning that especially if not everyone gets the notes on good signature management, a lot of this stuff is just going to be beaming pick me signals out into the open. There are also extensive issues with a lot of this stuff being vulnerable to jamming by opposing electronic warfare systems. Not strictly a communication system, but GPS signals in particular have been a frequent target of Russian and Ukrainian electronic warfare efforts. And then finally, a lot of this stuff, military or civilian, just didn't match the requirements for the type of warfare the Ukrainians and Russians were steadily moving towards. Drone warfare in particular, as we'll get to in a moment, brought with it a lot of its own demands. And with it, pressure for a system that provided extensive mobility, good bandwidth and performance, resilience against opposing electronic warfare, and which enabled a degree of signature management that at least made usage short of suicidal. As this increasingly became a drone war, the Russians and Ukrainians both also needed tools that were suitable for rapidly and flexibly sharing things like drone footage and images, not just audio or text. To enable the kind of speed we've seen out of both the Russian and Ukrainian kill chains, the ability to share videos and images in a very flexible way, in a lot of contexts, has really ceased to be an optional extra. For Ukraine, in some ways, the need was even more acute than it was for the Russians. A lot of their communications infrastructure was being actively targeted and destroyed by Russian forces, and while Russia could manufacture its own military-grade communication systems at scale, Ukraine often faced the difficulty of its primary suppliers, the NATO states, being relatively reluctant to hand over potentially sensitive data link and communications gear. What that meant is that without the preferred military solutions available, the Ukrainians faced even more pressure to find civilian options that would enable them to do the job. And for a lot of use cases, one of the preferred tools quickly became satellite internet, specifically low Earth orbit satellite internet provided by Starlink. The advantages here, just from first principles, are fairly obvious. Starlink terminals and plans were relatively cheap and available in large numbers. They relied on satellites, not in-country infrastructure like mobile phone towers, which made it very difficult diplomatically for the Russians to target. Unless you wanted to attack the relatively cheap terminals themselves, it wouldn't be enough to sling missiles and bombs into Ukraine. You'd have to shoot down swarms and swarms of American satellites in orbit. Because the satellites were in low Earth orbit rather than out in geostationary like some other satellite internet constellations, latency, so lag levels, could be comparatively low, and the bandwidth could be good enough not just for things like text and audio, but also to support things like video transmissions. By the available statistics, the Ukrainians rapidly became the largest European users of the system. They became a common feature of connectivity for members of the Ukrainian civilian population, and just about every Ukrainian business I've interacted with, and a bunch of Ukrainians themselves, ended up getting themselves terminals and dishes to help maintain connectivity. The Ukrainian military also became a massive user. For many units and applications, it became one of the key connectivity tools that then enabled them to power whatever other systems they might use, whether that be Discord or Ukraine's battle management system Delta. The terminals, especially the later minis, also were relatively not particularly power hungry, and so while not designed and ruggedized as military systems, were at least potentially more suitable for field use than some alternatives. But one of Starlink's most impactful use cases in Ukraine by both sides is probably specifically focused on enabling the drone war. For small drone teams on land, a Starlink terminal gives them a mobile, relatively low-profile communication system. And precisely because the terminals are relatively cheap, the Ukrainians, and eventually, as we'll see in a moment, the Russians, also figured out you can use these things on drones themselves. Many Ukrainian USVs we've seen, for example, the drone boats, quite visibly fit one or more satellite communication systems. This one here isn't even a Starlink specifically, it's an American Cometa terminal. But the basic idea here is that you can use these things to maintain long-range communications with a drone boat that might range well out into the Black Sea, and especially if you mount more than one dish from different systems at the same time, potentially be able to maintain reasonably stable communications, even if you're sending a system on, for example, a long-range tour out to the Russian port of Novorossiysk. It's worth saying the Ukrainians are absolutely not the only military that have recognised the potential of low Earth orbit satellite internet to provide connectivity for military forces or bases, but they have been the first to creatively employ it in a number of ways, and they've done so at a lavish scale. In terms of scale, things are always going to be imprecise, but there are a couple of numbers we can work with here. Back in 2025, we were seeing estimates credited to sources at the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence, suggesting there are potentially hundreds of thousands of Starlink terminals in Ukraine, with tens of thousands in active military service at any given time. Given connection quality at the front isn't always likely to be stellar, you'd expect to see it operated alongside other technologies. I saw one Ukrainian NCO quoted, for example, saying that where possible, they prefer to back Starlink up alongside things like wired or mobile internet. But even just in raw quantitative terms, with that many terminals out there, Starlink clearly matters, as was briefly proven when Ukrainian troops were left much more vulnerable during a Starlink outage back in July 2025. Russia, meanwhile, is not meant to have access to Starlink, and so their deployments were probably on a smaller scale than the Ukrainian ones. But, especially in 2025, usage did appear to be on the uptick. Russian-controlled Starlink terminals, in many cases reportedly purchased through third countries and then smuggled into Russia, began to be used extensively not just by, for example, drone units on the ground, but were also increasingly being mounted on Russian strike drones as well. The reason that mattered is because it enabled controllers to maintain connection with the drone well behind Ukrainian lines. On the right there you can see two examples, including on the bottom right there, a Starlink drone strapped to a Russian Molniya, That is a relatively cheap and low-performance Russian strike drone, and so if you're strapping a Starlink to that, it might suggest either that someone on the Russian side had played too much Gary's mod as a kid and was a bit too eager to lash together something interesting, or a belief on the Russian side that they had enough Starlink units to go around and could afford to use them on a relatively low-spec kamikaze drone. This development, frankly, scared the shit out of many Ukrainians. As long as the workaround remained open, where some bloke in Kazakhstan could order 1,000 terminals because, he really needed to stream stuff at high speed and then ship those across the border to Russia, it was logical that as time went on, the number of these terminals in Russian service would continue to increase. And being able to strap them to long-range attack drones created a whole bunch of problems for the Ukrainian air defense system. On one hand, it could make these UAS harder for the Ukrainian forces to jam, and on the other hand, give Russian pilots the ability to maintain control of their drones well behind Ukrainian lines. That might enable them to go after dynamic targets like air defense systems, for example, or potentially provide manual guidance, increasing the accuracy of these strikes. One of the most common Russian drones we saw mated with Starlink was the BM-35, a system weighing about 27 kilograms that we've seen used for strikes up to around 200 kilometers, although the Russians claim it can fly further. In short, Starlink wasn't the only communications option available to the Russians, even for things like drone control, but it was reportedly a useful one. Which gets us to why Ukraine pushed so hard for a way to turn off or disable the terminals in Russian service, and how they and SpaceX appear to have tried to do it. The reality of any of these communication systems, whether it's Starlink or GPS, is that at the end of the day, the company that controls the satellites is always going to have a degree of control over how they're used. In a sense, we've been down this road before. A reported denial of Starlink service early in the war, for example, foiled an attempt by the Ukrainians to attack Russian ships in Crimea. Whatever the reality of that incident, it demonstrated some of the limits of what a company controlling satellites like SpaceX can or cannot realistically do. They can't realistically stop Yuri calling up his mates over in Turkey or Kazakhstan, getting them to buy a bunch of terminals and then express ship them over. But while they can't realistically control the physical terminals, the signals to those units from the company's satellites was always a different question. And so what we saw were restrictions rolled out in two phases. Firstly, a speed limit was imposed for most terminals over certain parts of Ukraine. The logic being that a civilian Starlink user probably isn't going to be booking it at more than 60 miles per hour, and if they are, they probably shouldn't be connected anyway. But for Russian drones, putt-putting along at glacial speeds probably wasn't much of an option. That potentially helped minimise the use of Starlink terminals on Russian drones, but not so much by Russians on the ground, including drone control teams themselves. For that, we instead saw the Ukrainians and SpaceX work on a whitelist solution. Basically, the Ukrainians got military and civilian personnel to centrally register their terminals. Then, at least within certain geographic boundaries, only terminals on that list actually get service from Starlink satellites. Everything else effectively becomes an expensive brick overnight. There are obviously always going to be risks of a whitelist-style solution. You run the risk of some of your own units or civilians not being able to register their terminals in time and so losing access to service. But, on the other hand, unless your opponent finds a way to register their devices in your whitelist, it's a very hard system to find your way around. Like a guest list to an expensive venue, you're either on the list or you're not. But what actual effect has that whitelist had on the Russian military? Unless someone can start getting me an invitation to senior Russian MOD briefings, it's hard to know for sure. But I do think there are a couple of data points that seem to be gesturing in the same direction. A number of Ukrainian sources, observing the differences from their side of the line, seem to think that there has been an impact, although perhaps not a total or decisive one. They generally assess that Russian communications have been degraded, especially in some use cases like mobile drone teams. What they generally don't assess to have happened is a complete collapse of the Russian command and control system. There are still alternatives to Starlink that the Russian military can fall back on, even if they're not always the most useful substitutes, and we'll go through some of those in a moment. As quantitative evidence go, it's far from perfect. But some Ukrainian sources, as you can see on screen there, do claim that the number of daily Russian assaults has decreased since the whitelist went into effect. Per the Kyiv Post, quote, combat clashes over the past week averaged 130 to 160 attacks a day, distinctly less than the 180 to 200 daily attacks with peaks of 230 to 250 engagements, typical since the Kremlin launched a winter offensive, end quote. The challenge, of course, is that all that proves is correlation, not necessarily causation. But it does seem to suggest at least the possibility that the tempo slackened a bit after the Starlink terminal started to go dark. But as for whether the change seems to specifically be working on Russian terminals themselves, looking at Russian sources this time, the answer generally seems to be yes, and there are a couple of clues that make me feel at least moderately confident saying that. We've seen, for example, extensive complaints by Russians about their terminals being bricked, and posts like this one on Telegram with a helpful suggestion about how you might repurpose your Starlink terminal into something useful now that the Ukrainians and SpaceX have gone and flipped the off switch. Ideally, you probably wouldn't want to spend a couple of $100 on a table, but what else are you going to do with a satellite communication system that can't talk to satellites? And going by this image, there was at least one Russian drone crew out there that might have found a rather creative way to express the frustration with their Starlink terminal's new status. Suffice to say, to keep the video YouTube friendly, I'm going to pass on translating what they appear to have written on their drone. But suffice to say, I don't think they're thrilled about the whole whitelist thing. Comments and complaints about potentially tens of thousands of terminals effectively being bricked run from the frontline level up to the highest levels of the Russian government. We've seen unit-level figures complain on Telegram about their terminals allegedly going dark overnight. Those complaints were echoed by a variety of Russian military bloggers. Alexander Sladkov, for example, reportedly complained that, quote, "Our forces are urgently trying to set up an analogue," end quote. Another Russian channel, Two Majors, was somewhat less delicate, saying that, quote, "The fascist beloved by millions, Elon Musk, serves the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine. This may explain the massive failure of terminals that began yesterday evening on the front," end quote. For sources a bit more senior than military blogger, at the National State Duma level, one lawmaker observed that, quote, "It's important to understand that relying on anything Western in the current situation is dangerously overconfident. Even taking into account our active negotiations we're currently holding with the United States, that does not stop them from being our adversary." Then on Russian state TV, we had a typically proportionate response from Solovyov, who seems to have casually suggested nuking Starlink satellites. Quote, "I don't understand why, for example, Elon Musk satellites are not a legitimate target for us. One nuclear weapon detonation in space, as I understand it, solves this problem." With most countries or political figures, I think you'd be fairly safe to assume that if a nuclear threat is being made about something, it's probably a big deal. Then again, this is Vladimir Solovyov, who'd probably threaten to glass the United Kingdom if a Russian tourist stubbed their toe in London. Heck, he'd probably threaten to glass the United Kingdom if a Russian tourist stubbed their toe in Italy. Russian presenters generally seem to be massive fans of nuking Britain, and I imagine Solovyov wouldn't want to get any nuclear fallout on his Italian villas. Still, the scale and ferocity of the bitching involved is probably evidence that there's been at least some effect here. And likewise, if the system hadn't been useful to the Russian military or hadn't been degraded by the Ukrainian whitelist, you probably wouldn't expect significant resources to be sunk in trying to get around the block. And yet, that's exactly what I think we've seen. And because this is Russia, the land of the truly entrepreneurial, we've seen a number of Russian businesses and individuals rally to answer the needs of the Russian military in quite predictable ways. For example, by jacking up the price of Russian satellite internet terminals by roughly 400% overnight. On Avito, which is basically Russia's answer to eBay, terminals using Russia's Yamal satellites were recently priced at about 45 to 60,000 rubles, until after the Starlink shut off, when suddenly they shot up to around 200,000. Because apparently no one said that supplying troops in the field with desperately needed communications equipment shouldn't be a horrendously profitable experience. Then there were the scammers. Those who were advertising services saying that for a given payment, they could handle the reactivation of a blocked Starlink unit or the activation of new ones. As far as the Russian channels I've seen seem to indicate so far, these services appear to be less "I have a friend at Starlink" and more "trust me bro and give me your money." And in one case it's claimed the scammers might not even have been Russian, but rather Ukrainian. One Ukrainian group claimed to have created a network of channels and bots that appear to offer activation services for Starlink terminals for a fee. They claim to have received, among other things, 2,400 submissions of Russian Starlink terminals, including detailed geolocations of those terminals, a number of messages from would-be Ukrainian collaborators willing to register terminals in Ukraine for a fee, and a number of payments from Russian troops desperately looking for a solution to their comms problem. In that case, the locations of the Russian terminals submitted were reportedly passed on to the Ukrainian military, data on the collaborators to the Ukrainian authorities, and the thousands of dollars in payments received redirected to the Ukrainian military. The kicker here, and part of the reason you might openly publish something like this, is it may not exactly matter how true any of that is, because either way, you're potentially going to poison the well. If Russian troops are concerned that any Starlink activation service they see might secretly be the Ukrainians ready to direct fires on their position, they might be more nervous about using them. If would-be Ukrainian collaborators are concerned that any offer of cash they see might actually be coming from Ukrainian authorities, maybe they get a bit more nervous about taking the bag of silver. I bring that up not just because the entire situation is kind of absurd, but also because it indicates the scale of the problem. If your Starlink terminal didn't matter to you as a Russian military unit, you probably wouldn't be sending its location or making payments to random channels online hoping to get it turned back on. In that respect then, I think it's fair to say the Russian response to the Starlink shutdown falls into three main categories. The first response has just been to try and get the Starlinks turned back on. That includes offering to pay Ukrainians to register Russian-used terminals on the Ukrainian whitelist, or per Ukrainian claims, in some cases reaching out to the families of Ukrainian POWs in Russian hands, and pressuring them to cooperate and register Russian terminals, presumably or else. Measure 2 has been trying to find alternatives to satellite internet. That might include, for example, using a greater number of Wi-Fi bridges. But there are inevitably going to be some use cases, especially when it comes to drone operations or mobile UAS crews operating close to the front, where satellite internet is going to be hard to replace, which gets us to response option 3, replacing satellite internet with different but shittier satellite internet. Belarusian leader Lukashenko, for example, released this video showing off this piece of fine Belarusian technology here, apparently their own homegrown equivalent to a Starlink terminal. As of yet, though, I haven't seen them publicly release a specification sheet. For the Russians themselves, though, the main alternatives we've seen so far, barring completely different technologies like Wi-Fi bridges or cellular networks, that might be more vulnerable or less stable in contested EM environments, are their own satellite internet providers. And in Russia's case, technically, there are two. Russia's gas giant, for example, Gazprom, does have its own satellite communication system, and terminals can be accessed by members of the public and the Russian military. The problems compared to Starlink, however, are many. A lot of the terminals, as you can see on the right there, are bulkier and harder to conceal. The Yamal satellite constellation isn't a low Earth orbit system like Starlink, it's out in geostationary orbit. That does mean you need far fewer satellites to provide predictable, continuous global coverage, but it also means your signal needs to travel a lot further to get to the satellite and then back again. Geostationary orbit is very roughly 36,000 kilometres or 22,000 miles from the equator. Fair to say a bit of a hop, skip and a jump further than a Starlink satellite that might be bolting overhead at about 480 kilometres. That means inevitably, no matter how much bandwidth you have available, lag is going to be a problem. And for military applications where, as per Ukrainian drone operators, you might need 30 frames per second to reliably operate a UGV safely without driving into a ditch or into a minefield, playing with rubber band tier pings like it's the 1990s probably isn't going to cut it. Speeds are much slower, data limits tighter, costs considerably higher, and to add one extra complication to the whole affair, the Yamal satellites used by the Gazprom constellation weren't actually produced in Russia. They were launched on a Russian rocket, sure, but a lot of the work around the satellite bus and payload was instead contracted out to Thales Alenia Space, headquarters, France. And now I'm not suggesting that just because a joint French-Italian firm built the satellites in question, that there are automatically security vulnerabilities they're aware of, or ways to potentially jam or degrade the satellite's operation. But if there are, I can imagine Paris probably knows about it. The point is, while Russia is working on multiple solutions in parallel, none of them are perfect or instant. Russian satellite alternatives are just worse in multiple ways. Getting Russian terminals onto the Ukrainian whitelist is an imperfect and unreliable solution, and if the other technologies available were a perfect alternative, you probably wouldn't have seen Russian forces come to rely on Starlink the way they did. Essentially, I'd suggest some of the most dramatic narratives are wrong. That there hasn't been an overall collapse in the Russian command and control system, but a switch has been flipped on one of the key technologies being used. And from both a Ukrainian and Russian perspective, that appears to have made a difference. So where does that leave us in terms of likely next steps in the war in Ukraine and any immediate lessons to draw from it? I think the first thing to say is that while we can be relatively confident there's been an impact on Russian forces here, it's likely larger now than it's ever going to be in the future. That's because the moment the switch was flipped, Russian forces, as we noted in those earlier sources, began scrambling for alternatives, whether that be different satellite internet providers or alternative technologies entirely. As those adaptations are put in place, I think we should expect some of that friction introduced by all of those expensive terminals suddenly being demoted to tables, slowly beginning to dissipate, albeit with the caveat that once that adaptation cycle is complete, whatever solution gets put in place as a result is likely to be less desirable in some way, whether that be cost, performance, accessibility, or reliability compared to Starlink. I'll also note that a lot of the performance impact of the shutdown might be quite difficult to isolate. You would expect, for example, one of the big impacts of losing Starlink to be the diminished effectiveness of Russian long-range drone ops, but assessing whether those drones are less accurate or less effective now without terminals strapped to them, or determining how much less effective they are versus an alternative universe in which Russia was able to continue scaling up the use of this kind of technology, that's considerably harder. The analytical trap you can potentially fall into there is that because sides adapt to changes like a technology being ruled out, it can be tempting to say that no system, no technology, no event like this actually matters. They do. If for no other reason than adaptations usually have time and cost associated with them, and if you're not spending your effort adapting, you can spend it improving. Which touches, I think, on a bigger question. Why now? The Ukrainians and SpaceX have had at least some awareness of Russian usage of Starlink going back literally years. But it's only just now that we've seen the whitelist set up and SpaceX agree to enforce it. There are probably a lot of factors going into it from multiple angles. Everything from a shake-up in the Ukrainian ministry, to potentially the fact that SpaceX is getting closer to an IPO, and active usage of the system by Russian attack drones might not look great in the marketing materials. But a key element, I think, is that Russian usage was ramping up, and Starlink was starting to become particularly threatening as the Russians began to introduce it into their drone operations. Starlink-equipped electronic warfare-resistant drones were not a problem the Ukrainians wanted to deal with. They were a problem that was sufficiently threatening that was probably worth going to the effort of creating a whitelist in order to counter. And from an analytical perspective, when we're trying to determine how much this entire incident has actually cost Russia from a military perspective, that's probably where I'd be tempted to focus more of my lens. Not just on the functionality that Russia currently had, enabled by Starlink that they've subsequently lost, but everything they were planning or working towards doing with Starlink that they're now unlikely to be able to do, or at least not do to the same extent. Basically, this isn't just about a threat from Ukraine's perspective that's been eliminated, it's about a threat averted. I think there are also at least 3 military lessons to come out of this that other nations might be well served to pay attention to as well. The first is that low Earth orbit satellite constellations have now had a pretty extensive trial by fire in Ukraine and proven themselves militarily useful. Starlink has been a consistent priority electronic warfare target for potentially the most developed EW power in the world. And in that constant arms race, the satellite constellation has fairly consistently performed, often when other systems didn't. There have, to be fair, been scares. There have been multiple points throughout the war where Russian EW troops have appeared to get something of an upper hand, forcing SpaceX to push an update to potentially counter the problem. As the Pentagon's Director of Electronic Warfare put it back in 2022, quote, "The way that Starlink was able to upgrade when a threat showed up, we need to be able to have that ability. We have to be able to change our electromagnetic posture, to be able to change very dynamically what we're trying to do without losing capability along the way." End quote. The back and forth between EW attack and defense will obviously continue, but the reality is the Ukrainians are clearly able to make significant use of this thing, often right up against the front lines, while the Russians were also able to do so despite Ukrainian EW efforts up until the whitelist. For foreign militaries watching all this, that's probably an interesting observation, as is the potential, as Ukraine has demonstrated again and again in so many different fields, of potentially leveraging existing civilian systems to enable you to deploy something that is affordable and scalable quickly in order to meet a military demand. There is no universe in which Ukraine was rapidly able to develop and launch its own SATCOM system. Not every country worldwide can afford to have the same kind of satellite network that the US military or increasingly the PLA does. Likewise, Ukraine can't have a massive network of sovereign synthetic aperture radar or other spy satellites up there, and so is reliant on other sources to get that kind of imagery. But by their very nature, civilian markets tend to be much larger than military markets. And so if there is a way to take an existing civilian system or technology and adapt it for military purposes, as we've seen from both the Ukrainians and the Russians, that might be a fast way to plug demand in an emergency. However, in that story of Ukrainian success and Russian success and then eventual failure in using Starlink for military purposes, I do also think there are a couple of warnings for planners around the world. The first is less in the story of Starlink's success in Ukraine as why it was necessary in the first place. Both Russia and Ukraine reached for Starlink, and Ukraine for Star Shield as well, because the existing options available to them did not meet the need. Whether that's because there wasn't enough communications equipment, or it was too complex, or too unreliable, or not fit for the purpose in mind, the point is troops probably won't go racing to crowdfund a civilian communications device if the military has already given them something better and enough of it. And that doesn't just include the equipment you can give people, it's the communication system you can give them. In Russian service, things like Telegram are so useful, not just because they're a user-friendly way to shift information quickly, but also because troops and officers can use them to set up parallel communications networks. If you want to talk to another drone unit, for example, rather than sending that information up and across the chain until it eventually gets to them, maybe instead you just drop an image or a video in your Telegram group chat and say, "Hey guys, are you seeing this? Does anyone want to hit it?" What I think honest war planners need to be asking themselves then is, in an emergency, like a wartime scenario, what are we likely to be short on when it comes to communications kit? Where are the capability gaps? And if we can't solve those gaps through ordinary procurement, maybe the budget or technology just isn't there, what can we pre-plan about the potential adaptation or usage or leveraging of civilian technology and networks in order to make that transition or introduction as smooth and as effective as possible? If your country has a civilian low Earth orbit satellite network, for example, and you want that to potentially do some heavy lifting for communications in the event of a crisis, preferably you'd maybe think about that before the crisis arrives and figure out how you could potentially do it, what the drawbacks would be, and how to make that process as smooth as possible. From acquiring the hardware to figuring out the most effective way to do it, both Russian and Ukrainian forces needed to do this the hard way. The Russians really only started deploying Starlink at scale in their drones, for example, in 2025. There's several years of adaptation time in there that other countries aren't guaranteed to have if they end up in a war themselves. And so maybe it might be worth doing some pre-work. That also means acknowledging just how bandwidth-hungry modern warfare can be, along with just how hellish a battle space the electromagnetic spectrum can become. So if your contingency plans involve relying at least partly on a civilian system, perhaps it might be best to quietly check how that might respond to opposing EW first. I also think it's becoming increasingly difficult to deny that there is some geopolitical value that comes from controlling or owning a system like this. The US, through SpaceX, has, for example, been able to turn on Starlink in places like Iran during the protests there in order to stymie efforts by the government to cut off outside communications, allow allies to provide terminals to Ukraine as a way of supplying a communication system without giving them access to sensitive NATO systems, and at the other end of the spectrum, as the Russians have very clearly seen, what the Starlink hand giveth, it can also taketh away. That's likely to turn even more of a spotlight on an issue that was already getting traction in a number of capitals, which is tech sovereignty. One of the most frequent complaints or reflections, however you want to describe it from some of the Russian commentators I've seen, is the open question of how they became dependent on Starlink in the first place. Why wasn't there a Russian option with similar performance characteristics and accessibility that they could use instead? To paraphrase one, he's concerned that the Russians essentially convinced themselves first that the Americans would never turn off Starlink, and that secondly, if they did, they'd obviously turn it off for the Ukrainians as well, and it wouldn't be a disaster. But in the end, as he noted, they did turn it off for the Russians, they didn't shut it down for the Ukrainians, and it was a disaster. From software to satellites, the reality is a lot of countries out there don't really have sovereign control over the systems or technologies they rely on. Economically, that can make perfect sense. It enables economies of scale, compatibility across borders, and it means that a country like Ukraine can potentially access a system like Starlink that it would never have the resources to build itself. But that comes with the giant asterisk that as long as you're using someone else's system, someone else's satellites, someone else's technology, they potentially have a key point of leverage. In a crisis scenario, that might matter, and so it might be worth making additional investments during peacetime in order to ensure that, at least in critical areas, you're not solely reliant on an unreliable source. We already saw this happen, for example, with global navigation systems. In terms of cost efficiency and standardization, the best solution in inverted commas for everyone, everywhere in the world would be for us to all just use GPS. But, perhaps understandably, decision makers in places like Moscow and Beijing weren't particularly keen on the idea on wiring their entire societies and things like satellite-guided munitions into an American system that Washington could potentially shut off. And so we don't have one global navigation system, we have four: GPS, GLONASS, the European Galileo, and the Chinese Beidou. And then on top of that, you also have a couple of regional networks as well. It's not unusual in ordinary circumstances to have receivers out there like your smartphone that might query multiple networks. But the idea that powers like the US, Russia, China, and the European Union have is they never want to be in a situation where they're cut off from something as vital as satellite navigation because of a decision made in a foreign capital. The question now is whether going forward, satellite internet constellations will fall into that category where countries think they are important enough that it's worth investing in a sovereign option. In the grand state of play, the US already has the largest network there, Starlink, and is working on a second. China also has 2 LEO constellations in the works, and I'd be willing to bet, given the perceived strategic value of those projects, at least one is likely to go forward long term. Europe has its own push to get more satellites up there, and in the current environment, you'd probably expect plenty of backing to be forthcoming, out of a perceived need to have a European Starlink or Kuiper alternative in the same way that Galileo provided a GPS alternative. But where does all of that leave a country like Russia longer term? On paper, Russia does have a plan for its own Starlink alternative, essentially. It was reportedly already meant to be launching its first satellites in 2025, but that was subsequently pushed back to an undisclosed date in 2026. While it is hypothetically possible that this program at least eventually gets off the ground in a serious way, there's basically no hope of it being put in place quickly to fill the gap that Starlink has left. And even then, beyond that, I think we need to have questions. With Roscosmos currently essentially on life support and the Russian state budget tunnel-visioned on Ukraine, maintaining their existing geo-networks is probably credible, but launching a Starlink alternative isn't. Although I suspect that a lot of Russian troops will be worrying less about that longer-term issue than they are about patching over the existing short-term disruption. I think the best closing observation then is that for in the short term, for the Russian military, this stung. And it hurt, not just because of the short-term loss of effectiveness, but also the long-term improvements that they were denied. Russia's Starlink employment, especially for long-range drones, was really still in its infancy. It was a threat that was growing to Ukraine that was likely to continue scaling and developing. Now, at least in the short to medium term, that problem appears to be mostly off the table. But even in the short term, when it comes to maintaining the basics of Russia's military operation, sustaining command and control, enabling the military to essentially fight, the Russian military was able to operate in the pre-Starlink era, albeit somewhat less efficiently. And while the official Russian communication system remains deeply imperfect, there are other civilian technologies and systems that troops have been able to use to paper over the gaps. After all, part of the value in Ukrainian service hasn't always just been Starlink itself, but the broader systems and practices it plugged into. The Ukrainians haven't been effective just because they have Starlink, but also because they're very effectively able to quickly share a lot of information fairly openly between various units and commanders quickly using systems like Delta. The Russian story is arguably similar, with Starlink being an increasingly important component, but still only one piece of the puzzle. So I'd suspect that as long as Russian troops can, for example, continue to use Discord to share drone footage, or Telegram to rapidly communicate between units and get around the sometimes sluggish official communications channels, the effect on Russian military performance at the front line is likely to be significantly mitigated. That's as long as no one in the Russian government decides it's a great idea to compound the sudden loss of Starlink by also taking away or throttling some of those tools without an immediate viable replacement. After years of hard fighting, teaching harder lessons, that's the kind of self-destructive stupidity you wouldn't expect to see. Or apparently, maybe you would. See you next week, I guess. And okay, brief channel update to close out. I do hope you all enjoyed this one. I know communications technology isn't everyone's thing, and a lot of the time people are going to find it much more interesting to talk about the kinetic side of things, the major platforms, the weapon systems, the sharp end, if you like. But the reality is, without a good network, all those kill webs that look great on a PowerPoint slide aren't really going to mean much. I do think some of the reporting around the impact of the Starlink outage for Russian forces has been fairly greatly exaggerated. It clearly matters, but my assessment, as I said, is this is probably more impactful in terms of the future problems it averts for Ukraine, rather than the immediate damage it does to Russia's capabilities in the here and now. But I did think it was a useful opportunity to start talking about communication systems on a modern battlefield, how important they are, how nations can potentially run into problems with them, especially under wartime conditions, and so how other countries might be able to prepare now to limit the chance of that happening to them in the future. In terms of the channel more broadly, health-wise, I'm pretty much back to normal at this point. So what I'll try and do in the coming week is get a topic selection poll up for the patrons, although there's quite a lot in the backlog at the moment. While for those of you over on the Peru Gaming channel, there should be some updates there as well, although I'll probably package them into one of the regular Terra Invicta videos. I'm also preparing a short addenda to the Greenland video that I released last week. What I'll aim to do then is, once that's ready, I'll probably package it up as part of the channel update in the coming week, and if that works, maybe copy that approach, if I feel the need to add any corrections or addenda to future videos as well. For the moment though, thank you very much to all of you for your ongoing engagement and support. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and with any luck, I'll see you again next week.